Today we're going to talk about evaluating an accessibility conformance report. So we're looking at this now from the other side. What if you are evaluating a vendor's ACR? What are you supposed to be looking for to decide whether you want to work with this vendor, whether you want to use their product? So let's recap. What is an accessibility conformance report, or ACR? An ACR will state what accessibility standards a digital property meets. An ACR typically uses a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template, as its basis. It is a snapshot of a digital property's accessibility conformance at a point in time. So if there have been updates to a digital property, they probably need to be giving you an updated ACR. An accurate ACR gives potential customers a sense of the impact a product or service has on people with disabilities. So one of the first things you want to look at is the ACR using the correct VPAT. Since the VPAT is a template that's used to document the accessibility of a digital property, and there are many different types of templates, it's important to know that the vendor chose the correct standard. In order to understand the different kinds of templates, let's look at the different accessibility laws and standards that are out there. So first, we have Section 508. This was the original standard for which a VPAT was created for at the beginning. And this was part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And in the United States, Section 508 mandates that the federal government, any organization or agency within it, create and buy and use technology that is accessible to people with disabilities. And at the time, the technical standard used was the WCAG 2.0 level A and level AA. A more recent standard is a standard that was developed by the European Union, and it is called the EN 301549, and it's primarily used by public sector organizations in Europe to ensure, again, that technology that they procure from third-party vendors is accessible. And both of these actually incorporate the WCAG. And so we have an international standard, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that were developed by an international body called the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. This is, again, a global standard for digital accessibility. It has been adopted into numerous laws and standards all across the globe, including Section 508, Section 504, which tends to handle organizations involved in healthcare as well as higher education. And then Title II recently, this year, of the ADA was updated to incorporate the WCAG 2.1 AA as its standard, and of course the EN 301549, which again uses WCAG 2.1 level AA. So who created the VPAT? The VPAT was initially developed by the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI, and it was also developed by the General Services Administration of the United States, the GSA. It was based on the Section 508 standards that came out at the time, and it was basically a way for people to have something that was easy to follow, that an agency can look at and know that everybody trying to submit bids for government contracts was using a similar document, so it would be easy for them to decide whether something met their standards or not. But it became adapted for more than just Section 508, and in general it is used by all vendors now, both public and private sector, and it is international as well, for vendors to report their products' accessibility. In November 1st, 2023, the VPATs were updated, so it is important when you are looking at an ACR and it's using a particular VPAT as its basis to make sure that the updated version for the time that you're looking at it has been used. So vendors need to go to the website, the ITI's website, and look for the updated version of the VPAT, the latest one. And the latest one is from last year, so November 1st, 2023, and they have on their site 5 different documents. One of them is a change tracking document, so that basically helps people to understand what's different about this template from a previous template. But we're on VPAT 2.5, and there's an EU version, There's an INT version, so international. There's 508 for Section 508 specific projects, and then a WCAG kind of generic template as well. And this list also shows which WCAG levels are incorporated into the template. For the INT and the WCAG, because these are the most general ones that you might use for private sector or international, they encompass all of the WCAG levels up to 2.2. 508 again is still stuck at WCAG 2.0 until they update that standard. And then the EU, which is a little bit more recent, has WCAG 2.1 as the standard. And then another thing you want to look at is how was the digital property evaluated when measuring it against the accessibility standard. So one way of looking at how a digital property weighs in is to do manual and functional accessibility testing. So in this case, accessibility experts and users with disabilities will actually check the features and the user experience using assistive technology. So this is actual testing with assistive technology, with screen readers and other technology that might be used. And people who are competent using these technologies, typically actual users with disabilities, but also accessibility experts can be trained as well. And they will test the website using the technology and tell the vendor whether their product meets their experience. And it is good to get user testing because it helps you understand how a person with disabilities is actually going to be operating within your digital property, and they will identify any sort of barriers quickly. And then a second way of doing things is automated accessibility testing. This is when we use web applications that use an automated algorithm, sometimes now more recently using even AI technology. But basically it scans the site, looks for code issues that make it in not conformance with the WCAG. While it can identify common barriers, it's not really a replacement for manual testing because manual testing will flag less common issues that may not just be picked up because you're looking at just the code. Manual testing is always superior because you're actually looking at actual user experience with people with disabilities, and they may identify barriers that aren't so obvious with just automated testing. And with the recent talk we did regarding diffuse technology, I believe they came up with something like 58%. That's what they were picking up. So you can see it's not 100% to do automated testing. You have to do more than automated testing. And then you want to take a look at what are the conformance levels with all the different WCAG criteria. And they're going to have to note in their document, there'll be a table that lists all the criteria, and they're going to have to note, does it support, meaning it fully complies with this criteria, partially supports, does not support. The criteria could be not applicable. This is the case, for instance, there are a lot of criteria that have to do with media, so say audio or video files, and if there's none of that on their site or digital property, then it would be not applicable. And then not evaluated is also kind of an unusual one. You might see that the product was not evaluated against that criteria. However, this is only something that can be used for anything that's level AA, because a lot of times we see in the guidelines that the standards that people often request are A and double A, but nobody really requests triple A. But AAA is there, and it's basically a stricter standard. And for people with disabilities, it's great if a company decides to strive for level AAA, but it is not legally required anywhere. It's okay to say that you didn't evaluate against that. An example of a level AAA criteria would be audio description. So, for example, there was a big lawsuit against Netflix a couple of years ago where Netflix tried to argue that it wasn't their responsibility to make sure that things streaming on their website were accessible. It was the responsibility of the people that created the content. So, for instance, the film company or the TV company that created the product, that they were supposed to make it accessible. But they basically lost the case. and it was Netflix's responsibility to make sure that things streaming on its platform met accessibility standards. And after they lost and had to update things, they decided to go all the way to level AAA and added audio description. So if you stream something on Netflix, you can often add audio description. And audio description is actually describing what's happening on the screen for the user. So it's typically for those who are blind. And so audio description will not only have the dialogue between the characters, it will also describe the scene that the characters are in so that they can get a mental picture of what's going on screen. And so this was not required, but Netflix went all the way to AAA standards. So you could say, for example, that while you have media on your site, you did not evaluate to the level AAA standard. That would be acceptable, at least at this time. So again, accessibility standards do change over time. So at the time of this recording, AAA standard is not required in any of the accessibility laws that are out there so far. They actually tell you that they partially support, do not support, support. Anytime somebody says that something is partially supports or does not support, or even these other two, you want to make sure that it makes sense, that it really is not applicable, or it was appropriate for them to say that it was not evaluated. But if it doesn't fully support something, then they need to explain themselves. So you want to make sure that the remarks portion is filled out. So why is it that they only partially support this criteria, or that they don't support this criteria? Are they trying to do something to make that a future fix? What are they doing to handle this known issue? And that's important to see that the company has taken this assessment seriously and they've recognized now that they have a problem, and what are they going to do about it? And then other information to look for in an ACR, typically they follow a certain format, so they should have a title, a date, when are they reporting this, because again, standards change, things get updated. You want to make sure you're reading the most up-to-date publication about their accessibility standards, that it's not something that was 5 years ago and probably you need to request an update. They need to clearly state which guidelines and standards that they're using, and you need to base whether they think they're using the right standard, and also that they use the VPAT that meets the right standards. They should be telling you which VPAT they're used, what edition, which version. Are they using 2.2 when we're on 2.5? So you need to double check all these things. And then they need to provide their contact information, so if you have questions, you can reach them. Make sure that there are terms that may be unclear to you, maybe something that has to do with their particular technology. Make sure they define terms so that everybody understands what's going on. And then you should know the name of the digital property that's being evaluated, what version of that product is it, because again, we have more than one version often when things get updated. And if there are any relevant details, they should be putting it in the notes. And this is the only section that can be left blank if there are no other relevant details that they need to tell you about. And then they should have the tables that list out all the criteria and then whether something is conforming or not. The product should be described. What is it for? What's the purpose of the product? And then they should be, if it's not readily apparent, they can be stating what are the evaluations used. Did they just use automated testing? Did they also do manual testing and automated testing? And then what are supporting documentation? Did they do any other scanning or have test results or user testimonials or any evidence that supports any of the claims that they're making in their ACR? You should be aware of. And often, a company may have more than one product, so you may be receiving more than one ACR for different products. And then if you can evaluate the expertise of who wrote the ACR, that's helpful too. So anyone can fill out an ACR. We said that last week with our talk about VPATs in general. Anybody can fill out the VPAT, the owner of the company, someone in the company. But what exactly is their expertise of accessibility? Do they have training? Because the more training you have, the more likely your ACR is going to be accurate and complete. If the person filling it out has no idea what the WCAG is and how are they going to know whether it supports or doesn't support various criteria. It's important to understand the expertise of the people who filled out the ACR. Did the company collaborate with known accessibility experts who have specialization in evaluating and ensuring compliance? Were they working with experts? Do they have experts on staff? What were the qualifications of the people filling out the ACR? Did they enlist in a third-party service? So sometimes you can hire services. Maybe you don't have accessibility experts on staff, but you want to take this seriously, so you want to hire a third-party service. And so did they hire someone? What was the expertise of the third party? And again, larger organizations tend to have their own experts inside. So they may have an accessibility team, and it'd be important to know who's on that team and what is their experience. And then third party integration. So if their software, if their digital property involves the use of a third party integration, they should be letting you know about that, first of all, and then also letting you know what was the assessment of the third party integration. Did they assess it in their ACR? Was it adequate or inadequate? And if it's inadequate, how is the organization handling the issue? Are they looking for a new vendor? Because when they spoke to the vendor about accessibility, the vendor was uninterested in doing anything to change what they were doing. It's important to understand where they are with their third-party integrations and what's going to happen with them moving forward. Common red flags to look for, again, is there a VPAT that's helping them fill this out so that you know that they have all the things that need to be there? If they're not using a VPAT as a basis, then that signals maybe a lack of knowledge as well as a lack of transparency. Do they have too many high numbers of not supported or partially supported items? And are they adequately explained? Perhaps they do have a lot of situations where they have partial support, but are they explaining that? If they are and they have a plan for remediation, perhaps that's okay. But if they don't explain what they're doing, then that's a huge red flags. And then if there's a discrepancy with user experience, if with their automated testing they're saying something supports something, but then when it comes down to actual user experience and it's not supported, then that's a problem. And if there are sections left incomplete, they've marked a lot of things as not supported or partially supported, but without explanation. So that's technically incomplete, and that's a flag. And then if their responses are vague or generalized, then that's obviously a red flag as well. So final thoughts, an ACR is a point-in-time snapshot. The digital property will evolve. You'll have new content and new features added to your digital property. And as a result, it may no longer conform. So it may be time after you've done a lot of updating or added new features to do an updated ACR. If you want to save time and if you want to save money, then in order to make sure your digital property remains accessible, you should integrate accessibility in the product development lifecycle. So make it part of your product development to consider accessibility, and that will help you, because if you're thinking about accessibility when adding the new features and the new content, you'll understand what you need to be doing to make sure these new content and new features are already accessible, as opposed to adding them and then looking back. That is always more expensive. So any type of remediation is always more expensive than building it right the first time. Reactive fixes are time consuming and expensive. So be proactive. Prioritize accessibility in design. Test it for accessibility during development. So before you release the product to the public, do some user testing of your own and identify problems ahead of time and then tackle them. And then do role-specific accessibility training. So people have different roles in your company, but everybody should have accessibility training in mind, and that is appropriate to what they're doing in your company. But it's important for the development teams, the coders, the designers, those people all need to be trained. And then do ongoing monitoring, so making sure you periodically do testing so that you can identify issues. Make sure that you're open to comments from the public about your product regarding accessibility. If you get a complaint, don't ignore it. Take a look at it and see what you can do to improve. And usually it's helpful to set up an accessibility policy with specific guidelines and guidelines you can measure so that you can create and maintain an accessible experience for all your customers.